Hello, and welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour, the weekly bridge to the future of the piano tech community. I'm David Anderson.
And I'm Ethan Janney. And we're here to ask great questions, and then we'll shut up and listen to some of the authorities, experts, and most outstanding personalities in our little world of pianos.
So, put on your best set of headphones, and let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. Welcome, one and all. Good to see everyone. Sorry, we're getting up to a little bit of a late start here, but we're ready to roll now. So it's good to see you. Great to have you all here. And yeah, we have yet again a wonderful guest this week. Lots of participants I see streaming in here, so that's great to see you all. And I will get us started since we're starting late. I'll just give the intro and then we'll get rolling. So welcome to Piano Tech Radio Hour. This is brought to you by Piano Technicians Masterclasses, cutting edge instruction from piano industry masters without leaving your home. And remember that we are going to have a convention coming up in September. Very exciting. And we're going to do an interesting setup that we've gotten votes for from you all, which I think you're going to like because you all voted. We just listened to what you might like. So we're actually going to do a 3-day conference. We're going to spread it over 3 weeks. So you only have to commit to one day each week for 3 weeks. It'll be a Thursday of the first week, Friday the next week, Saturday of the next week. So you can work around that, and not feel overwhelmed by a full convention schedule. And then we're going to do something else really interesting. Along with that convention, we're going to do a concurrent set of conventions. And in the first week, we're going to do a convention for piano teachers. We all like to work alongside of piano teachers because, we can complement each other's services. And so we're going to create a special day of lessons for piano teachers as well, and try to integrate our two groups a little bit as part of that. Then the next special day is one for musicians, piano players. And in that case, we're going to try to get some interesting folks to do some lessons and offer insights on how to optimize your piano playing or do something cool as a musician. And then on the third week, we're going to do a complimentary session that is going to be all about the piano industry. So we can learn about the different brands of pianos and everything going on in the piano industry. So it's looking to be like a really big, fun event. So keep tuned in and I'll update you on how you can sign up for that and get involved. So without further ado, I'll introduce our guest today. His name is Chris Brown. Chris Brown, he's a registered piano technician of Grandwork Tools. He started his career as a piano technician in 1977. He's one of the leading piano techs who's mastered various skills like concert tuning, rebuilding, and teaching. He is also a college technician, private customer piano care provider, along with being a designer, engineer, and manufacturer. All that engineering and designing, despite the fact that he told me his math is doesn't go much far beyond his what he learned in grade school and high school. He said he looked out the window most of the time, so that's great. You can do a lot with that level of math, and I think some of us don't even take advantage of what we've learned, I guess. And Chris has done a wonderful job. So actually, why don't we start off by going into that a little bit? I was fascinated. We were just talking beforehand, and you kind of made this offhand comment, like, you didn't feel like you were some master of math or something like that. But then I was pairing that with how you've created engineering projects, and that I think I myself would be intimidated by designing and producing these things. How do you think those things go together?
I think all piano technicians are somewhat gifted at math, but that's not to say that they studied hard and weren't looking out the window when they should have been paying attention.
Got it.
Somehow my son got himself into an advanced group in middle school. And he did all the great math, and the best sections of the sciences. Whereas I was just kind of bored by it. But anyway, applying what math I do have, which is, I suppose, high school geometry and algebra, mostly, I hit upon this idea of, I'm not the only person to have this idea, and there might well be a better version of it out there, but I have a monthly, I try and make it monthly blog on my website. And the last one involved creating a simple mathematical model for the workings of a grand action. And not with a view of being able to put in my measurements and come out with the exact whatever, but with a view of understanding better what happens when I change the leverage in any one or a couple of the three levers involved in a grand action. So the three levers are the key, and you measure from somewhere on the key top. And that is an interesting problem because the finger plays where it plays and the lever changes with that. So in that simple lever, it's like a seesaw. You've got a fulcrum in the middle of the key, but in terms of leverage, it's not the middle. And you measure from the top of the key top, wherever you decide that's going to be, down to the balance hole, the middle of the balance hole on the underside of the key, then up to the surface of the capstan. So from the key top to the balance hole is your effort arm, and from the balance hole to the capstan is your resistance arm. In the whipping, you have sort of a complicated thing, but simplifying it down to how the geometry pretty much works. You have from the capstan / whipping heel to the whip center, and then from there to the tip of the jack. And from the capstan to the whip center is your effort arm, and from the center to the jack is your resistance arm. And then on top of that, of course, is the hammer shank, hammer and hammer shank. And that measures from the contact point on the
knuckle?
On the knuckle.
Or wait,
Excuse me.
Yeah.
To the center, and then from the center to the crown of the hammer. And so I chased my tail round and round with measuring that, and I turned them into leverages by dividing the resistance by the effort arms. So from the crown of the hammer to the center, if you divide that by the distance from the center to the contact point on the knuckle, you get a ratio. So my idea was that you take the weight of the hammer and you multiply it by this number, and that is the weight that's going down through the knuckle. So everything above the knuckle, I call the hammer resistance, and then you go down the next step and you have a ratio that is what it is, and that goes to the key, and then the keys ratio, and the numbers weren't coming out. So I was out of town as I was thinking about this, and when I came back to the shop, I took some measurements at an action, and I can show you. Let's see if I can just walk you over there. Where are you? Ah, here.
Yeah, we're getting there.
bunch of junk in behind it. But if you can see, I've got two vices, and one I've set up with a couple of just wooden blocks so it would reach. And I grabbed the hammer shank with that. And the other is holding the whipping. And so I went through a series of measurements, not all in this disposition, but along the way, I realized that the leverage in the shank doesn't apply to the weight of the shank, or at least not equally. You know, if you were going to take, you'd have a whole series of leverages as you came back to the shank, back up the shank to that center. So I weighed the shank, and it's tricky weighing these things, but I weighed it so that it was virtually horizontal, and added that to the hammer weight times its leverage, the shank leverage. And then I did the same thing with the whipping. I weighed the whipping as it was held in a vise, i.e. by its rail, and added that to the hammer resistance, which is the shank plus the, anyway. And
is this,
and anyway, when I got to the other end,
is this a blog post that you finished posting? Is that up right now?
Yeah, it's on my website.
What's the title of it? I'll make sure and give people a link to it.
Well, the title that you might see is Weighing Off the Grand Action Part 7.
Okay, yeah, got it. Cool.
So it's kind of a fun enterprise. And, you know, I haven't really gotten to the point yet. At the end of the article, I've taken one example and run it through and show you how raising the hammer weight and lowering the hammer weight translates through this math at the other end. Now, in real work, say you have hammers that have been filed a couple of times, and that's what you're stuck with because people don't have the budget to replace the hammers. Those hammers are very light compared to the original hammers. That changes the weigh off. So depending on what the original weigh off was, it could be that you have a problem with upweight. How about, and I have a couple of these in hand at the moment, you have an action that was rebuilt by somebody or new parts were put in by somebody, or is this very old and compressed and the geometry has changed that way. All of these scenarios, and really an action from the time it leaves the factory, it's in a state of settling and compressing, and that geometry is changing. And so what we get may work adequately well. We have a kind of a window of what's acceptable. And certainly when you're preparing for a concert, you get the note that's sticking, not sticking, and the buzz solved, and that sort of thing. But I find myself at this point in my career being able to say, you know, this is what I propose under these circumstances with the parts that you have. And it's not as inexpensive as you'd like, but otherwise we're going to, you know, it's like opening up an old house. Once you get the sheetrock, the plaster off the walls, you discover stuff you didn't know about. You might have suspected, but it is what it is. And so I propose that whatever your solution is, you run samples and find out how those samples work. And what I'd like is a little model, and that's the idea of this model, to plug my measurements into maybe only once, you know, and then the next 7 actions that come after, I might not plug the numbers into, but I have a sense a refined sense of what happens when I change various things. And actually in my career, I've been changing knuckles almost back to 1980. You know, it was in the early 80s that I started realizing, well, I started receiving some of these actions that had parts just put on them, and the parts didn't quite fit. They weren't a match for what came out. And so it was typical that rebuilds in the Boston area in the late 70s and 80s drove like Mack trucks. What do you do about that? So I would push and pull, but I begin this article with an idea that is, you know, it's a throwaway sentence, but it's basically, how do we become professional at the things that we think we know? So at the genesis of this article, there's the idea that in a grand action and an upright action for that matter, there is a trade-off between weight and distance. So if you have a weight benefit, so say your hammers are a little heavy or you want the action to be lighter and you move your knuckle out of a millimeter or a 16th of an inch or something. And that change in geometry makes the effective weight of the hammer lighter. But at the same time, it makes your ability to have blow distance and achieve your aftertouch with a certain dip. You've got a shorter hammer rise in exchange for that hammer being effectively lighter. And that's true of all the different things that can change in the action. And of course, when we start to analyze one of these situations, it's important to recognize the cost of changing things. Like some things you just can't change, or maybe you can, but it's just very expensive to, you know, if you want to change the spread distance in a Steinway, you've got to change the darn rails. There are little tweaks that you can do, little workarounds, but basically it's set up to be a certain spread. I've had a couple of jobs recently that had, you know, different style weapons from today's standard. And they had little spring cords that were going to fail and stuff like that, reasons why they just had to be replaced. And anyway, I replaced them with the parts that I favor at the moment. And these had a, you know, a standard modern disposition, but their geometry is quite different. And anyway, hopefully in the end, when I complete this series of essays on the subject, instead of it becoming more and more complicated, it will be summed up in something that is actually quite simple, which is you understand the principles well enough to try a thing. And the thing about trying is, if you try and it gets worse, okay, you went in the wrong direction. Cost you some time, but you know, you learn that, whoops, that's in the wrong direction. It becomes more complicated when you're changing more than one thing at a time, obviously. And there is a hierarchy, and it has to do with, again, with the leverage. So the hammer weight is such a big deal because it has a 6, 7, or 8.5, up to 8.5 times amplification through the leverage of the shank, depending on where that knuckle is placed. It makes the pinning very sensitive. My little tightening the flange trick, which I've shown before with a Menino brooch with the tip of it, That works on a hammer flange because of that big leverage and the sensitivity of those bushings, whereas it doesn't work at all on a repetition lever. They're just, to make that repetition lever firmer, you need a bigger size pin generally. And even then, it's hard to get it to stay where you want it.
Can I pull up this blog post and maybe people will have at least some of the images in it to look at here. Let me see. What do we got? So are folks seeing that?
Oh yeah, there's me weighing the shank.
Yeah. And then I enlarged this just so we could see the pictures better. But yeah, so
there's nothing like, so originally I computed these from, I realized that I couldn't just go from the center to the knuckle core to where the hammer was hung, although those measurements, in this case, it's an 18 millimeter from the center knuckle position. And the hammer is hung an inch, 5 1/4 inches out. Those are a little bit unusual. That shows you the translation from the previous action. Because in a Steinway, it would be either 15.5 millimeter distance or a 17 now. The Germans were always 17. And probably 5 1/8 and possibly less, depending on the model. So one of the interesting things about this distance from the center to the crown, in the case of this particular piano, this job that I'm working on, I custom bored the hammers. And weirdly, the bore for hammer number 1 and the bore for hammer number, I don't know, it's 53 or something, is the same. Do you understand what that means? Typically we have a treble bore and a bass bore, and they're typically measured from the outermost hammers, which are easiest to see. But in this case, the hammers are getting bigger from the bass to the tenor in the bass section. And then they're getting bigger from the tenor to this 53, and then smaller down to 88. In terms of string heights, that's what's happening. And if you want to have your regulation with all the shanks the same height above their rest cushions, which, it has a bit of leeway. As things settle out, it's fine for the shanks to, the blow distance to get a little bit longer and shanks to get a little bit closer. But if you have, say, 1 3/4 blow distance, and for all of your hammers, and you've got a 2-tiered boring distance, it can mean that this 5/16 probably difference between the bass bore and the tenor bore. You can have that much difference added underneath the shank above its cushion if you've got the same size hammer there. And in the case of this action, the hammers that were there were too long, and there was no room. The shank was sitting on the cushion, and you still couldn't get 1 3/4. So getting to understand the implications of these things, I personally like to have a consistent blow distance. And I like to have a consistent aftertouch. And I like to have a consistent dip. Well, how do you do that? In one of these, and I would suggest that there are many pianos like this. I'm going to take a little sidetrack here. Why? There is a design aspect, I think, with the overstrung scale where there's a tilting up of the strings in the bass and a tilting down of the strings in the tenor so that it enhances their clearance without, see, just by tilting it like that. However, cast iron plates, when they cool, warp. And I would say fortuitously, they warp in that direction because we have a soundboard that is crowned in that direction to resist the pressure of the strings. And there can be a harmony between those crowns, a consolidation in which the piano is more stable rather than less stable. If you have the strings perfectly flat like that, but the soundboard crowned, there is a tendency to push the soundboard apart. Whereas if they sort of match each other, it all kind of the up push of the soundboard and the down push of the strings are in alignment. Anyway, so you have a string heights that are crowned, and a place where it's very noticeable is in the high treble of a Steinway, where it's significantly lower than the middle. And yet, for whatever their reasons, they have the hammers be the same bore distance between those sections. They would shorten the tails in the treble. Yeah, probably that's for weight, I think. But a problem that is discussed sometimes in the trade with a big question mark beside it is why there isn't adequate checking at the top of the bass and in the middle of the piano, sometimes under certain circumstances. And I would suggest that if your hammer is a certain length and your back check is a certain height and your strings are higher there, that you just have less overlap. And or if you lengthen your blow distance, you have less aftertouch or more dip needed. Whatever it is, it affects that back checking. And the other thing that happens, if your shanks are off their rest cushions by too much, those rest cushions are a safety. When the hammer comes down, the shank meets that rest cushion and then resets. And if the rest cushion is too low, it's possible that the tails could tap. You would discover that. But the other thing that happens is the back side, the rear shoulder of the hammer collides with the top of the back checks. Ever seen buckskin all over the underside of the back of your hammers and wondered what the heck? Well, that's what it comes out of. So anyway, all these different things contribute to why unless the strings are very close to being level as a whole, I custom bore, because you're making the bore longer in the middle, where I would say, hammer weight for projection, it's nice. It's shorter up at the high treble where lightness of hammer is good for tone. And it's a little bit shorter down at the bottom of the bass where you're challenged with compensatory lead. So there's kind of a symbiosis of the custom bore. The only thing about it is that the longer the bore, the more your flare angle affects its neighbors. And of course, as you may well know, I like to have my hammers arrive at the strings vertically when I can. And if you've got, well, certainly if you've got a 16-degree flare angle, you've got problems to begin with probably, but if you custom bore, you're going to make them worse. So all those things have to be taken into consideration. How do we become more conversant with these problems before we retire so that we can benefit by it? And
Right.
one of the things, okay, so we're a trade deeply set in tradition. It's, I suppose, in the world's point of view, it's only 300 and something years. That's not that long. But in terms of human human life spans, it is. So we've many times over, the people doing the business have taught the people they're hiring, the people apprenticing them, what they know. And this gets passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on. And each of us, as we receive this knowledge from our teacher, suddenly find ourselves with the pressure on, particularly in the modern age where we don't keep working for the same person. We gotta get a job someplace, and suddenly you're expected to do it all on time, in a short time frame for a certain amount of money. And there isn't time to follow all the different ramifications down to the place that, possibly our intelligence could take us to. We just accept what the person before us said. And some of the things are more right and some of them are less right, or more optimum and less optimum. And so anyway, I'm trying to think through some of these things now that I'm approaching my dotage quickly before the gray cells. If I can't think of the name of knuckle, on the way into this discussion, obviously, things are eroding. But
I've always been that way, a little bit more investigative, and you're right. It can be a trade-off. You can't get as much work done when you think about that work too much, right?
Right. But here's the thing:
change something or perfect something.
But you're nudging up to a really good point, which is that if you don't do some of this work, if you don't do your samples at the beginning of a $5,000 job, you can end up docking yourself $1,000 worth of time at the end of the job trying to correct something that, had you properly sampled, you would have discovered at the beginning. Discovering it at the beginning costs something, but there's an investment in your mental and emotional energy that if you know where you're going and you're going there methodically, you feel entirely differently about it than if you're scrambling, and you go, whoops, oh, jeez, if I'd only.
It reminds me of a tip I got. It reminds me of a tip I got from a fellow piano technician when we were actually, I think it was when we were studying for the technical exam, upright regulation, which is kind of notoriously short on time, but a lot to be done. And he said, everybody, just take a second, and I want you to untie your shoe and then go down, and I want you to tie your shoe again as fast as possible, and I'm going to time you and see how fast you can do it. And then everybody went, and they tied their shoes, and he timed, and we made a note of it. Now he said, okay, let's do it again. Untie your shoe. And this time I want you to tie your shoe, and don't make any rush of it. Just tie your shoe like you normally would. And I think he had gotten this type of little exercise from someplace else, because it turns out that oftentimes you actually end up tying your shoe more quickly when you just do it in a sort of paced, natural, unrushed way than when you think that you don't have enough time to do it. So that kind of goes along with taking your time, thinking about it. Don't rush through things so you don't make mistakes you have to fix later.
Not making mistakes is a bonus. And the tools that I've developed for regulating, one of its big bonuses is that, and actually, one of the cheapest kits on my site is, what implements this. is to be able to go out to the bench and actually set up so the work you do is real and accurate. And taking dip samples and let-off samples is not accurate enough. And becoming adept at keyframe betting is really important, because if your keyframe isn't well bedded, then whatever you do is going to be slightly erroneous on the bench. But if you can go from the piano to the bench and have the bench have the exact parameters in dip and strike, then all the work you do is forward motion as if you're doing it in the piano, only with the advantages of better light and better ergonomics, and maybe it's in your shop where you can concentrate better. But if you put a lot of time and energy into something and then have to redo it when you go back to the piano, that is a headwind. And so
tell me this. Tell me this photo, because when you were explaining it before and you showed us the workbench and you said you got a couple of vices there, I couldn't quite get it before, and I think I'm still a little bit confused, because when I weigh something, like I would imagine I want the vice on the left but not on the right, or on the right but not on the left, because is the purpose here to weigh this? And if you're trying to weigh it, then aren't the two things supporting it on either side gonna?
So
what's going on here?
Okay, so what's happening is the whip and flange is held in the vise on the right, and the hammer flange is held in the vise on the left, as if they were the rails. And they you can just play them essentially. So it's very tricky to weigh, and 98.4 is the number that actually works. And I have to be very careful about how I manipulate it. I could get it to give me all different kinds of numbers, and it's a tricky thing about weighing this. But what we have here is... I
got it now. So I've seen, and maybe everybody else got this before I did. That's fine. So the flange on the whip-in there, you're sort of weighing the whip-in and the weight of the hammer on top of the whip-in at the same time. Got it.
So I've done them separately and then together.
Okay.
And I've also weighed the shank, and then I weighed the shank with the hammer.
And how do you know what, aside from just by sight or something, how do you know like what levels and angles to put those two things at?
Well, I set up the angles to reflect what it would be like if it was in the piano.
Okay. And you get measurements that are good enough just by
yeah. So it's a very complicated thing. For one thing, each of these parts goes through an arc. And as it's going through that arc, gravity works vertically. And so it starts off, it's pulling here. It's different when it's pulling there. It's different when it's pulling there. And so, but the point of the model, and the model works quite well considering that it avoids the total confusion for most of us of that deep math. It stands in for it, because really what we're looking for is, what happens if I change the knuckle? What happens if I hang the hammer a little further out or further in? Well, in terms of the weight, where you hang the hammer doesn't make that much difference, relatively speaking, but where you place the knuckle makes a lot of difference. And the thing is, both of these things have a proportional effect on distance as well as weight. And so you have constraints in terms of distance. You have the strings are at a particular height. You've got a belly rail in a particular place. You've got the action needs to fit underneath it in a certain place. And really, when you're setting up, a lot of the possibilities for changing things are just eliminated by the constraints of, the physical setup. We're not going to change the action cavity, although you can change the stop that the action bears against. And that, to position the overall action so that it's neutral in terms of the connection between the parts, rather than, having all your hammers have to go in one direction or all of them go in the other direction. That's pretty important. And I guess I'm encouraging people to recognize what can be changed, and that just because it comes with a fancy name on it doesn't mean that it was set up correctly in the first place, or that it's set up correctly for the current circumstances. And maybe the piano is rebuilt and the plate is in a slightly different position. But that stop, you can grind it down so that it's thinner, you can shim it. Sometimes they come uncovered. They're just wood on wood. It's all up for grabs, but you need to do it responsibly, and you need to try out your solution to be sure that it actually does what you think it's going to do and doesn't create other problems that you're going to regret, or somebody will regret.
That makes sense. Anybody have any questions for Chris? I know we've got a lot of cool information in so far. We got about 15 minutes left. So if anybody had anything pressing they wanted to get his opinion on, or share, or throw out a topic that you'd like to discuss, feel free to pop it in the chat. Otherwise, we could just keep it rolling here. And I think you touched upon it a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about this process of the process of learning, the process of trial and error, and how you see that, in terms of making mistakes and being perfect, and the balance between the two things.
The best piano makers tried and tried again, over and over, through generations. Some Chickering might not have been the best, but they were interesting. There was one point in my life where I worked on 3 Chickering quarter grands that were all born. They were a year apart. So one was 1910, one 1911, one 1912. And they were entirely different from each other. They were just, one of them happened to have been my piano that came down from my grandfather, and it was the nicest of the 3. That made me feel good. But, it was just interesting circumstance that I happened to meet those 3 pianos. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known that, which is something to be said for working out in the world of older pianos, which, some of us get to and some of us don't. In my last 15 or 20 years, the volume of work that comes through my life is very limited. And so I can get a bright idea based on one thing. It's been a challenge in developing the tools, because I worked on a lot of Steinways and a lot of Masons, and less of these other permutations. But anyway, Steinway was the same way. They would retool every 15 or 20 years, and the parts would be slightly different. Why? Because they thought it would be a little bit, of an improvement for various reasons. Then there's the accelerated action. And what came after that, the aftermath of that, has a long shadow. Yeah.
So point being, like, you see that even in brands that are maybe respected for reaching certain ideals, let's say, they're always doing some type of experimentation, and some things go right, some things go wrong, but it's part of the process of evolution.
Yeah.
And to be willing to introduce experimental
Steinway
things.
was entirely right to be trying Teflon. They were just the science of composite materials wasn't quite there, and they didn't understand what would happen when the thing was sitting in a flexible part that was subject to humidity changes, and that the material would change with that. But I mean, look at the W&G hard bushings are great. They're very consistent, very dependable.
Yeah, it's a process. So a couple folks threw some questions in here. So let's see if we can cover them before we cut out here. Pat Wilbur, there's a few, so let's see if we can get them all, at least that we have right here. Pat Wilbur says, yes, if it has been rebuilt, we need to check the geometry. What would be your process?
Well, I'm going to check how things work. I would like to have a standard blow distance, because if it's longer, that gives you a little more power, but you have a greater distance to reset. If it's under, I'm used to 1 3/4, whatever the millimeter equivalent of that is. If it's under 1 3/4, then your power suffers. And so that's a pretty important dimension in terms of the way an action. So if I put that in place, and then I have a range of what is acceptable for key dip, and the outer limits of that is that sharps can't be more than 1/2 inch high, and the dip can't be more than 420 deep. And those constraints, they're pretty firm, because people will hurt themselves playing actions that are, if it's too deep, or you've got to raise your fingers too high, or they'll suffer the dumbing down of an action that has too short a blow distance. So if you put those things in place, you will find out what's happening. And then I consider upweight and downweight. A minimum of 20 grams upweight. And the maximum sort of depends on how much lead there is in the system and how much inertia. But so how do those things look? And then, do I have a comfortable aftertouch? My jack cannot be jamming in the window in that aftertouch. So, if there's not enough space between where the knuckle is and where that repetition lever window ends, that can be a problem. See, very quickly, you're brought into a place where either everything works and it feels pretty good, or something doesn't feel good, and why. And trying to have all the dimensions be not a spec in the sense of a certain number, but a spec in the sense of how it works. So you just need to have aftertouch, and you need to have blow distance, and you need a dip that's reasonable. And between those things, look into your springs, look into your friction is really important, and how much lead there is in the system.
Cool. I'll jump on to the next one, and then we might have time for Alan. Sorry. David said he's willing to skip his question because he was curious about Alan's question. Alan Etter says, could you elaborate on the point you made that replicating let off and key dip on the workbench is not sufficient, that keyframe bedding must crucially be dialed in?
Repeat the question. I think I understand
Yes.
it, but
He said, elaborate on the point you made about replicating let off and key dip on the workbench, that you said that it's not sufficient in replicating it on the workbench,
So
but the
at
keyframe
speed,
bedding must be crucially
look,
dialed in.
at speed, these parameters work pretty well, and you're basically doing it in the piano. But if you're going out to the bench to then work on the parts and reassemble them and do a full regulation, and say your piano is in a different place or in an awkward place to get to, and you don't want to go back and forth to the piano, that it costs time even if the piano's in the same room. But dip has the problem of a soft punching. And the soft punching just makes it somewhat inaccurate. And let off is not the real index, but strike is. Let off is in relation to strike. So knowing exactly where strike is, which is a three-dimensional entity relative to the action. There's, down the key, in, out, side to side, and up and down. If you know where that is, and if your keyframe is the same as it was in the piano, functionally, then it will work. But I think in general, the trade has found that they have a bunch of touch-up when they get back to the piano under that way of doing it. Why? That bunch of touch-up, you did hard and meticulous work. Why should you have to touch it back up when you get to the piano? And if your parameters of strike and keyframe are the same on the bench, then when you get back to the piano, you don't. And so even if it costs you a little bit of time to set up that way, in fact, it doesn't take very much time. My method for doing it started off exceedingly slow, and it has ended up being quite fast. So, if you're accurate on the bench, it's just much easier to work on the bench, I find. Easier on my aging body.
Great. Let's see if we have more. Bravo Maestro, says Alan Eder. Great. Your comments are appreciated. Thanks, Alan. So we've only got about 3 minutes left. That's not really enough for a sort of an elaborate question or topic. I can revisit what David asked and see if we want to get into it briefly. So Dave Skolnick asked about inertia. He said, do you examine or otherwise connect inertia to your system?
Definitely. Yeah, that is too much lead in the keys, too much inertia. You've got hammers that are heavy, adding, contributing to the situation. But really, in general, you're better off to let the darn thing be heavy than to add lots and lots of lead to make it appear to be lighter, because you've got to set all of that stuff in motion. And then once it's set in motion, it has to then stop. And it's an impedance to the player, really, and it can hurt them too when they're playing fortissimo.
We got one quick one from Bruce Gibson. How do you transport actions?
I refer you to Mark Deeroff, a fine technician in New Hampshire. And I've actually purchased a little truck, thing that he carries it with. But he wraps up the action, places it on this, and it makes it easy to go in and out of the house. And I admit to just picking the thing up and putting it in the back of my vehicle. And if it's raining, I wrap it in plastic and pick it up and put it in the back of my vehicle. But I have a 6-foot arm span. So, and I keep myself in shape with Tai Chi. So my back is in good shape. But I would love to have input from various people. And I've given some thought to a method, but there are a lot of different sized bodies and the leverages that go with that. And I haven't come up with a universal solution. Have a second person. Inform them of the delicacy of the treble hammers if you're giving them the lighter end, which you should.
I put a link here in the chat for New Hampshire pianos. Is that the mark you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's got a great way of doing it.
Cool. Well, awesome. That was great. That all fit into our remaining time, and that we've about wrapped up the hour. Elday says, thanks, Chris. Nice to see your face. Yeah, really great to have you here yet again, Chris. Always thoughtful and have a depth to your answers and insights. So really great to have you once again. And if there's nothing else, we'll sign off and put some links in the chat there if you want to leave some feedback on this session that's useful. We've got recordings from the last convention that you can grab. And if you want to sign up to get direct access to these sessions each week and the recordings, there's a link for that in there as well. Pretty soon we'll have some links so you can sign up for the convention. We're excited about that. Thanks, Bruce. Bruce said thanks and Susan said thanks. Good to have you all here. Chris, I'll sign up, but I'll jump back on with you in a minute. We'll have a chat. Okay, guys. Talk to you later.
Thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time. Remember that you can catch us live online every Saturday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
That's right. Go to pianotechradio.com to register so you can interact live and ask questions of our guests.
See you next week.